August 17th, 1998. Reports of missing persons and strange creatures in the sewers begin making headlines in the Raccoon City Times. September 23rd. Umbrella's nest wrecker operation targets Dr. William Birkin with disastrous consequences. September 28th. Raccoon City is overtaken by monsters as Jill Valentine begins her final escape. September 29th. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield arrive in Raccoon City, unaware of the evil that awaits due to government lockdown. October 1st. Raccoon City and its population of 100,000 is nothing more than a smoldering crater. This is the fall of Raccoon City, the story that defined Resident Evil.
I'll give you stars!
July 24th, 1998. This is STARS Alpha Team. We are now entering the Arklay Mountains. The story of Umbrella's infection of Raccoon City isn't one of a simple viral outbreak and spread, but a story of years of experiments and creeping death. Of course, the Spencer Mansion housed the corporation's horrifying research for decades. But in the years leading up to the Mansion incident, continual issues showed that this seemingly all-powerful organization could no longer stem the tide of death, with zombies and Cerberus dogs running wild in the Arklay Mountains. And even though the Mansion's destruction in July of 1998 briefly brought the horror to an end, Umbrella's experiments continued due to the company practically owning the city. The horror story of Raccoon City's destruction plays on two types of terror. There's the visceral body horror of zombies, infections, and inhuman monsters that players have to fight against. And there's the intellectual horror of people devaluing the lives of others for profit and pleasure. We see that second type of horror in the cold, calculated inhumanity of Umbrella's higher-ups, who let Raccoon City's infection spread, and the mania of characters like Police Chief Brian Irons or William Birkin, consumed by their obsessions. Umbrella's influence is everywhere in a town they help grow, controlling the police and dismantling STARS as revenge for the Mansion, and planting labs across the city for continued experiments in the middle of a vulnerable population. Umbrella's Death Factory, designed to dispose of their failed creations, becomes so overwhelmed in the months between the Mansion's destruction and Raccoon City's fall that the ground around it becomes contaminated. Umbrella's hidden facilities in the sewers become infected, with workers turning into zombies and all sorts of monsters, both created intentionally and accidentally, lurking underneath and in the darkest corners of the city by the middle of August. Even Raccoon General Hospital, overwhelmed with a growing tide of patients suffering from an unknown disease, is home to a secret Umbrella lab in the basement, observing the infections the city's doctors have no hope of understanding. By the time Umbrella chooses to intervene, it's too late. September 15th, we have authorized the deployment of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service. While Raccoon City is referenced in the original game, everything important about it all traces back to Resident Evil 2 in 1998, produced by Shinji Mikami, directed by Hideki Kamiya, and written by Noboru Sugimura. And while RE2 underwent significant changes when the game now commonly known as Resident Evil 1.5 was scrapped deep into production, the plan was always to tell the story of a citywide infection, with a focus on survival while locked inside a police station. 2 uses the fundamental aspects of Mikami's original game and its survival horror approach to gameplay, but its larger setting alters the core of the horror we're experiencing. We're no longer trying to escape one contained horror. but fighting to survive something that's way bigger than us. And in an echo of the original game, Leon and Claire's escape leads them to Umbrella's nest, hidden under Raccoon City and ultimately responsible for the outbreak. By the end of RE2, the mutated William Birkin and Mr. X are defeated. Umbrella's nest facility is destroyed, and Leon, Claire, and Sherry have escaped the city. But nothing has been resolved about the town's fate. What we're left with is the lingering promise for mass-scale horror on the level of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, but similarly constrained to just a few locations due to budget, only hinting at the devastation just outside those doors. In the years and many games to follow, we'd better understand why the horror of Raccoon City has stuck with fans for decades. 000, September 23rd. Umbrella Headquarters, this is Hunk. Commence Operation Nest Wrecker. In any medium, the zombie apocalypse is part mass-scale nightmare and part wish fulfillment, letting audiences play out the fantasy of survival and the breakdown of society's norms, with a monster that doesn't give you moral qualms about killing. There have been so many RE games set during the Raccoon City outbreak that it's practically its own subset of the franchise. Of course, Resident Evil 2 first brings us into this little apocalypse, but its focus is fairly small, and its time frame is designed to bewilder our lead characters of Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. The contagion has already destroyed the city, and we've been unlucky enough to wander in at the perfectly wrong time. Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, folds around 2's time frame, showing us the first days of Raccoon City's collapse and its final moments as Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira fight to escape the city. Remakes of both of these games use modern engines to bring this outbreak even closer to reality. Does anyone besides our few lead characters make it out alive? RE2's minigame focused on Umbrella's security operator Hunk is titled The Fourth Survivor, making it clear just how few Capcom originally intended to escape. Hunk is one of those mysterious badasses with a cool look that are more popular than they probably should be. I call it the Boba Fett effect. A character that has such a good look and vibe that it makes up for not actually being interesting. The original Outbreak game in 2003 and File number 2 in 2004 place you in the shoes of everyday Raccoon City citizens. Raccoon Citizens? Unlike the mainline games, these aren't pros with deadly skills whose actions have a direct impact on the life and death of the town, but are instead just a few of the thousands of normal people fighting to survive in what was once their home. It's much more along the lines of the typical protagonist you'd see in your average zombie movie. The people like you and me who don't understand why this is happening, and may not live to see another day. Sorta the opposite happens in Operation Raccoon City, with players taking the side of either the Umbrella Security Service or a US Special Ops team. Instead of the classic RE survival horror that underlined Outbreak, this is a heavy gunfighting action game. The Umbrella Chronicles and the Darkside Chronicles would let players relive the events of 2 and 3, with an emphasis on shooting. Not the most compelling stories, but again, Capcom and RE fans just couldn't quite move on from Raccoon City. You know, when I stop and think about it for a second, Raccoon City is a terrible name for a place. I mean, I like raccoons. They're actually kinda cute when they're not fighting each other inside your garbage can at midnight, but I wouldn't name a city after them. That's like putting down stakes and deciding your new home is gonna be called the Cockroach Collective. But at this point, it's so synonymous with the larger meaning of Resident Evil and the zombie apocalypse that we don't think about it. Sorry for the tangent. The premise of a citywide zombie outbreak is most like the classic zombie movie, but while it's the RE story that's most like the movies that inspired the series, it's also unlike anything else in the game franchise. While the general premise of most RE games is the character or characters entering some sort of world of horror and trying to survive, almost all of them have the player entering a pre-existing nightmare that's been hiding from view. Resident Evil 1's mansion has decades of genetic experimentation. 4's rural Spanish village is home to an old cult. 5's Kijuju is a more recent outbreak, and Resident Evil 6 is, well, let's just move on. But 7's Baker family home is a years-long backwoods festering evil, and 8's village has been home to a plague for a century. All of these stories play on the fear of discovering some form of long brewing evil. the uncanny existing in the shadows just outside our perception. The horror of 2, 3, and everything else connected is the horror of disease, monsters, riots, corruption, and disaster suddenly invading your home. Schools, parks, hospitals, police stations, stores, the places you take for granted in everyday life, turned into slaughterhouses filled with the living dead, and worse. This dead city is the modern necropolis. Ancient Greek literally meaning city of the dead. Necropoli have existed for millennia, and in the past were separate planned burial sites located outside of a city, filled with tombs, markers, and giant structures for the dead. Ancient Egypt's necropoli were ornate monuments to the dead ruling class, with the Great Pyramids being the most famous of these structures. Other necropoli were constructed to almost be a mirror of real, working cities, complete with homes that looked like those these burial sites were built near, but inside housed tombs that went deep underground. In ancient cultures, these attempts to replicate the living world for the sake of the dead aligned with beliefs that everything someone was buried with would be brought to the afterlife with them. Through a modern lens, these almost feel like a dark inversion of society. It's why modern archaeologists and fantasy writers misunderstood the Egyptian mummy and turned it into a mystical monster. One culture's average religious rites become another's spooky obsessions. Fear of death differs between cultures and generations, but it's no mistake that the zombie of Resident Evil is a modern fear. At first brought to screen in George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, these flesh-eating reanimated ghouls became a modern update of the Haitian voodoo zombie slave. And in Dawn of the Dead, they fully took form as a dark satire of social failures, brainlessly living out their base consumerist instincts. Zombie hordes put pressure on the tiny recreations of society formed by the protagonists of any story, until it collapses in a miniaturized version of the failings happening at large in the world. All monsters play off some type of cultural fear, and zombies spark our fear of the uncanny, something strangely familiar but deeply wrong. Across the scope of the Uncanny Valley, zombies exist at the point of the most uncanny, scarier even than a simple dead body. When you see a dead body, our fears and sympathies come from the realization that this empty shell without a spark of life is just a little bit removed from our own bodies. Zombies intensify the fear by making the body move, but in all the wrong ways, and by returning the most elemental need to survive to that dead body. No matter what medium it's told in, the zombie story always boils down to being a tale of survival, and is in some ways a fantasy fulfilled. The zombie strips away all elements of society and returns us to the most basic needs. We never identify with the thousands or millions already dead and reborn. We're the few who are smart, strong, and deadly enough to still be alive. But zombies themselves are a corrupted version of that survival instinct, a base enough instinct to exist beyond death. Over the years, the zombie has been given many different reasons. Satellite radiation, toxic waste contamination, even Dante Alighieri's Inferno has traces of the zombie centuries ago, with damned souls in hell separated from still living bodies. A precursor to the fear of Romero's Dawn of the Dead.
When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
Resident Evil's zombie has a definitive origin, the T-Virus, a bioweapon designed to reanimate corpses as weapons that can destabilize a targeted society. No afterlife, no aliens, just electrified meat given another jolt. Raccoon City sparks the uncanny fear of the zombie on a mass, society-wide scale. Now, safe homes are filled with death. Zoos filled with natural life are now death traps filled with giant zombie animals, even more dangerous than a human. The police department, hospital, and every government building designed to enforce societal norms are emblems of societal collapse. In the span of just a few days, the living and breathing Raccoon City has become inverted, turned into a necropolis. Raccoon City is never set in any specific state, and since its Middle America aesthetic and surrounding forest are meant to make it as generic as possible, it feels like a stand-in for any town in the US. It's fascinating to me that Capcom, Mikami, and team, all located in Japan, decided to set Resident Evil in the midst of a generalized America. Japan is no stranger to horror. But what it says to me is that Resident Evil is playing with the modern tropes of American horror, transitioning from the stock action heroes of the first game to the societal horrors of Romero, an idea reinforced by the director being hired to film RE2's live-action commercial. And the zombie, while adopted in horror around the world, was designed to speak to American fears and comment on American social issues. In Raccoon City, the fear of our society's fragility is exacerbated by our fear of inhumane corporations running wild, free from law. Targeted by Umbrella for his plans to betray the company, scientist William Birkin is mortally wounded by Hunk's team and injects himself with the Golgotha virus, a bioweapon that makes the T-virus seem like child's play compared to its abilities to transform anything into a pulsing, powerful, Lovecraftian monster. G-Monster Birkin's rampage destroys T-virus samples, infecting rats in the sewers that connect to Nest, which quickly ripples through the city. The fall of Raccoon City is a tipping point. Zombie infections of the most vulnerable members of the population that can't be explained. Then, an exponential infection rate that local news stamps across every front page. And before you know it, death in every street as the US military locks down Raccoon City to both halt the T-virus spread and keep the news from reaching the rest of the world.
September 28th, daylight. The monsters have overtaken the city. Somehow, I'm still alive.
With the city's water supply infected by the T-virus, infection rates explode, and there's a brief few days where people still try to live their lives even as everything collapses. Raccoon City then completely succumbs to infection, with the RPD and STARS unable to stem the tide of the undead, and Umbrella's UBCS sent in to be unknowing test subjects against their BOWs, with even more monsters airdropped into the chaos. What really sets the horror of Raccoon City apart from your other tales of the zombie apocalypse is the same element that differentiates all of Resident Evil: the sheer amount of really fucked up monsters lurking around every corner. The zombie T-virus may be responsible for the mass death of the city, but the Umbrella Corporation's experiments and the accidents that cause infections to run wild fill the city with a massive array of nightmares. Lickers, giant spiders, Deimos, grave diggers, leeches, hunters, a giant alligator in the sewers, big ol' plants, couple of tyrants here and there, and a zoo filled with a bunch of zombie animals. Plus, the presence of the G-virus in Raccoon City's sewers creates all sorts of dang-ass freaks that defy all reason. The massive amount of monsters rampaging through the city is the result of Capcom trying to keep their games exciting when zombies become run-of-the-mill. But they also tell the story of genetic experimentation allowed to run rampant. Lickers are the result of T-virus zombies that have eaten so much flesh, they mutate into something way more dangerous. Claire and Leon's journey into Nest shows that the fall of Raccoon City was just a matter of time, with piles of experiments kept underground with no real way to get rid of them. Birkin's rampage was the match that lit the powder keg. G-Monster Birkin's pursuit of his daughter is extremely Freudian, almost an Electra complex. The Golgotha virus corrupts the body and the mind. And then there's my number one, a guy, Nemesis. What makes Nemesis so scary is, besides how impossible he is to kill and the fact that he's basically a mutated tyrant that can use heavy weaponry, he's designed and unleashed by Umbrella to specifically hunt down and kill STARS. Amidst all the chaos, death, and destruction caused by Umbrella's experiments getting loose, is the organization's effort to exact revenge on the small group of elite cops that have been a thorn in their side. It's the ultimate example of corporate corruption that, when all hell has broken loose, Umbrella chooses to not help stop the disaster they've caused, but instead make it worse. All of these creatures are by their nature bioorganic weapons, monsters designed to be unleashed by governments on targets for as much destruction as possible. And the idea that they could be let loose by accident makes the fall of Raccoon City even scarier.
Attention all citizens. The missile strike on Raccoon City will occur in just hours. The payload is designed to eradicate all biological material. You will not survive if you remain in the city.
October 1st.
Evacuate now. Repeat.
No,
evacuate now.
can't be.
In the final hours of Raccoon City, our remaining heroes run for their lives before their home is wiped from the face of the earth. Resident Evil 3 is a much more heroic story than either previous game, and Jill Valentine is one of the best video game heroes ever. A hero cop betrayed by her department, and fighting against one of the most terrifying monsters of the entire franchise on her own. Jill searches for a cure to the T-virus to save her home, and while Raccoon City is ultimately beyond saving, she stops the unstoppable and survives.
Next time, take the fucking hit!
Larger-than-life heroes like Jill, Leon, and Claire give the fall of Raccoon City a heroic bent amongst the horror, while monsters with a mission like Birkin and Nemesis give a stronger through line to the chaos. The heroes of Raccoon City ultimately can't save it, no matter how hard they try. But these battles turn this mini-apocalypse into a struggle of good versus evil. In the aftermath of Raccoon City's nuclear destruction, the US government quarantined the area and covered up the truth for years. Again, the idea of a giant corporation inextricably tied to a government gives RE a ton of socio-political commentary hiding under the surface of its outlandish survival action. And this localized apocalypse gives both Capcom and fans the chance to experience the end of the world on a small scale, and still be able to move on. What is life like after you realize that all sorts of horrible monsters and diseases can be unleashed at any moment, and that no social constructs can really do anything about it? Most of the Resident Evil games that followed live in the shadow of Raccoon City, and the fight to stop it from happening again propels haunted survivors like Jill, Chris, Leon, and Claire. So what is it about the fall of Raccoon City that continues to resonate with players? I think it's that Capcom and Mikami's franchise so quickly capitalized on the full potential of the premise created in its original game. The contained but creeping horror of the Spencer Mansion incident exploded into the infection and destruction of an entire city, not only letting players live out the horror thrills established in so many zombie movies from decades past, but also denying the happy ending of the original game. What we thought was contained couldn't be stopped. Raccoon City wouldn't be the last metropolis to fall, but none would be explored as in-depth as the home of Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and STARS. It's been almost 2.5 decades since Raccoon City was destroyed, but in some ways, the franchise has never fully moved on. Live-action movies like Resident Evil Apocalypse and Welcome to Raccoon City completed the cycle of influence by turning the video game Outbreak back into a movie. The remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 brought us back to Raccoon City to relive its destruction with modern gameplay. But what was most exciting about these revisits was the chance to better see the full scope of the greatest tragedy to ever happen in this franchise. Resident Evil and its fans will never truly escape from the American Necropolis of Raccoon City. Thanks for watching today's video, and happy Residecember Evil, everyone! This is the third week of our ongoing month of all Resident Evil videos all the time, and I hope that you're enjoying this slightly different video from what the rest of this month will be. As you can tell from these videos, I'm having a focus on the early years of the Resident Evil franchise. And to me, when you think about Resident Evil, and especially when you think about the first decade of games, the story of Raccoon City is so important. In my mind, it's the story that fully realized the potential of the franchise, and the story that allowed all of the creators of Resident Evil to fully homage the many different movies that inspired them in the first place. As I talked about, the Raccoon City Outbreak has so much to do with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead, which compose his original Trilogy of the Dead, which is all about societal collapse as seen through the eyes of the zombie apocalypse. I did a video on that a few years ago, so if you're interested in that, go check it out, because it will give you more information about what Romero was trying to do with his zombie series. And a few years ago, I also did a video on what makes a great zombie movie, which touched on a lot of the different aspects that go into this enormous subgenre of horror. So if you're interested in hearing more about the context of Resident Evil, go check those out. And obviously from what you've already seen here, I have a huge affinity for zombie movies, zombie video games, and the Raccoon City games of Resident Evil. Really, I think that Raccoon City is a fantastic story and a great scenario for a lot of games. And I really wouldn't mind having more games set in it, because Resident Evil has gone off into many different areas and taken a lot of different paths away from this original story. Personally, I'd really like to see a remake of the Outbreak series, because I think there's so much that you could do with that with modern engines. So hopefully, whether you're a die-hard fan of RE or you don't know much about the franchise, you enjoyed this journey through Raccoon City and the larger meaning of its horror. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Raccoon City games of RE, as well as maybe what your own personal favorite location is in the franchise. Also, a large portion of the music used in this video is by Mono Memory, so please go check out Mono Memory's Bandcamp, which I've put in the links and description below. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video and exclusive Patreon-only reviews. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and remember, always check to see if a city is overrun by zombies before you head to it for your first day of police training and/or to check on your missing brother. Happy Residecember Evil!